Well, welcome back, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. And as we have been doing throughout the day, I want to start our presentation this afternoon by acknowledging the Coast Salish peoples of this land, whose land touches the shared waters and all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations who flourish here today. I'm so delighted to have all of you join us here for this panel discussion. I think our keynote speaker, Knut Berger, provided the perfect segue to this panel in his comments about the military-industrial complex in the Pacific Northwest. And now we're going to be able to dive more deeply into that history, some of the politics behind it, and how it has shaped the Pacific Northwest for all of us. The title of this presentation and this panel is Puget Sound Workers and the Soldiers in the Global War. It is a panel discussion with three concurrent sessions that all are going to pick up each where they left off. I'm going to introduce each of the three speakers. As we've been doing throughout the day, we are going to hold those questions till the very end so that we're going to be able to then turn on our cameras and be able to see each other and have more of a conversation. So I do invite you to post your comments in the chat, and at the end of their presentations, we will have a few minutes to be able to dive more deeply into your questions. So without further ado, though, I do want to introduce briefly our three speakers, beginning with Megan Churchwell, who is, as you can see from your screen here, the curator at the Puget Sound Navy Museum. Megan has been the curator there since 2014. Her background includes a BA in American History from Willamette University and a Master of Arts in Museum Studies from the University of Washington. Megan's research centers on connecting the local Navy story with wider histories, and she's curated exhibits including Skin Deep, the nautical roots of tattoo culture, and Hitting Print, Navy on Board with 3D printing. Megan's presentation, as you can see here, is going to be Keeping the Fleet Fit to Fight, Bremerton's Puget Sound Navy Yard, 1941 to 1945. Megan will be followed by John Little, who will be presenting on Ready, Aim, Misfire, Building Boeing's Bombers, 1935 to 1948. I don't know if these speakers all picked these alliterative titles together on purpose, but they're kind of tongue twisters. John is currently a volunteer at the Museum of Flight in Seattle, where he worked from 1994 to 2020 in the museum's security, education, exhibits, and collections department, and most recently as an assistant curator and team leader. He holds a BA in history from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and pursued graduate studies at the University of New Orleans under Professor Stephen Ambrose. And batting cleanup today, Dr. Bill Woodward, from emeritus professor from Seattle Pacific University. And his research interests focus on iconic elements of regional and national culture, including Homeland Security. He co-authored a recent pictorial history of the Washington National Guard, which was released in 2019. He earned his AB from Wheaton College in Illinois and an MA and PhD from Georgetown University. And he is a Washington National Guard member, where he retired with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. So thank you very much in advance to all three of our speakers. And Megan, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you. And I just remind everyone to please mute yourself if you haven't already, or I will do that for you. And keep your cameras off if you don't mind. Thank you so much.
All right. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining me this afternoon. As Lisa mentioned, I'm the curator of the Puget Sound Navy Museum, which is over in Bremerton, so across Puget Sound from Seattle. And it's right next to the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, which is the focus of my talk today. Now, specifically, this presentation will focus on the shipyard during the crucial World War II years. Now, the shipyard is perhaps best known for its activities during this era. And as you'll see, Bremerton's Puget Sound Navy Yard played a significant role in the construction, repair, overhaul, and maintenance of U.S. Navy ships during the war. It was among the only West Coast facilities that were available to repair the Navy's largest warships, making much of this work unique to Bremerton Shipyard. Now, before I get into all that, I want to start by taking a step back to look at the shipyard's early development. Now, today, it's one of Washington State's largest industrial facilities and one of its biggest employers, with around 15 to 16,000 workers. But of course, it wasn't always that way. Now, back in 1891, when the shipyard was founded, Kitsap County was still pretty rural. And in the early years, the remote shipyard found it hard to attract work. And so it grew slowly, limping along through a couple of fairly peaceful decades without a lot of war work to keep it afloat. Thankfully, it got a boost from World War I era ship construction projects. By the height of World War I, it employed 6,500 people. And during that war, it really established itself as crucial to the Navy's Pacific Fleet operations and as a major force in the local economy. But of course, America's involvement in the war is fairly short. Almost as soon as the shipyard can get ramped up for war production, the war's over. And once the authorized wartime work is completed, layoffs hit the shipyard and it reaches a post-war low of about 1,300 workers by 1930. Now, stemming from the end of World War I, the Washington Naval Conference and the resulting treaty had a big effect on the shipyard. Following the end of the war, this treaty was designed to prevent an arms race. It limited naval construction and controlled the size of the world's naval fleets. And this was combined with an overall drop in the Navy's budget, reflecting the country's pacifist mood. And all of this combined meant there just wasn't a lot of work for the shipyard to do. And then, of course, we hit the Great Depression. Now, initially, this economic downturn hit Bremerton just as it did other American cities. But federal spending at the Navy Yard actually cushioned the area from feeling the full effects of the national economy. Now, the region as a whole obviously suffered a lot during the Depression, but actually here in Bremerton, business was booming. There was a lot of federal money that was attracted by the shipyard. Under the Works Progress Administration, the federal government sponsored the construction of the giant hammerhead crane, which remains a defining feature of the waterfront view to this day. It hasn't been used regularly since the 90s, but it still stands nearly 200 feet tall and has an official lifting capacity of 250 tons. Now, in the build-up to World War II, the shipyard also built the largest machine shop west of the Mississippi River, as well as its fourth and fifth dry docks, all of which would leave it well prepared to meet the busy pace of wartime ship repairs. Now, all of this buildup at the shipyard was made possible by a pair of political elections, beginning with the 1932 election of President Franklin Roosevelt. Now, he was the former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he was a staunch supporter of the Navy. In particular, he saw naval spending as an important factor for the nation's recovery during the Depression. And specifically, he sent out to use shipbuilding as an employment program. He made warship construction part of the 1933 National Industrial Recovery Act, and this ended up funneling millions of dollars to Bremerton's Puget Sound Navy Yard. Bremerton's success during the Depression was also thanks in large part to the efforts of Warren Magnuson, who was elected in 1936 to represent Kitsap and King counties in the U.S. House of Representatives. There, he quickly secured a seat on the House Naval Affairs Committee, and the shipyard's lobbyists soon started hounding him for help. At one point, they sent him a telegram that read, "We want men hired, and we want them hired now. Get a special appropriation, do something. Bremerton is sick and tired of promises." Magnuson spent significant time lobbying on behalf of Bremerton's shipyard. The congressman himself commented, "I sometimes feel that I eat, sleep, and drink the Bremerton Navy Yard." Now, his efforts to bring federal funding to Bremerton shipyard were particularly fruitful during the late 1930s and into World War II. And so the federal money that flooded into the shipyard during the Great Depression left its infrastructure poised to meet the demands of World War II. The Puget Sound Navy Yard was now the main West Coast naval shipyard, and it was well prepared for the effort of maintaining the naval fleet. And as a result, when Europe again plunged into war at the end of the 30s, the Puget Sound Navy Yard stood ready to assist. But of course, the country still had officially a neutral stance politically, and it prevented the shipyard from actively participating in the European war, at least from the start. Still, there were signs of the war starting to show up in Bremerton. As the war expanded in Europe, though America was still officially considered neutral, the shipyard started contributing to the war effort through the Lease Act, signed by President Roosevelt in March of 1941. And this act enabled the United States to send war materials and to build ships for Britain, while still officially remaining neutral. Now, locally, this allowed Bremerton's Navy Yard to start building ships intended for the British Royal Navy. In November of 1941, under the Lease Act, it got orders to build 8 destroyer escorts for the Royal Navy. But of course, the United States entered the war just a few weeks later, and so those ships ended up joining the US Navy fleet instead. And shown here on the left is the launching of one of them. It's USS Sanders. This was not the only way that Bremerton Shipyard contributed to the early war effort. In May of 1941, the British battleship HMS Warspite suffered damage from German air attacks, which killed 38 of her sailors. And because of a lack of available facilities to repair this damage, she actually ended up coming all the way to Bremerton for repairs. And this is really when lots of shipyard personnel and local residents first experienced the war firsthand with her arrival in August of 1941. Now, this move was a little bit controversial politically since America wasn't officially involved in the war yet. So President Roosevelt's decision to allow the Warspite to come here was met with some controversy on a national scale, but local residents welcomed the sailors with open arms. The British sailors who arrived with the Warspite were invited to dinner and overnight stays at many Bremerton homes. And she was actually still here in Bremerton on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack. And in the immediate aftermath, the ship was readied for the possibility of a Japanese attack. Since she was a foreign Navy ship, she'd been allowed to retain her ammunition, while the other ships at the shipyard had been disarmed for their maintenance period. And so her guns would have been the only ones able to respond immediately to an attack. And so by mid-1941, sentiments at the Navy Yard had shifted considerably. No longer was the problem lack of jobs or work orders. And as the treaty limitations expired, a new battleship race was on. And so as Bremerton's drawn further and further into the war effort, it became clear that thousands of new workers would be needed here. And even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, employment numbers start to grow. In 1940, the national unemployment rate is still over 14%, but Bremerton stood at just 6.9%, reflecting the importance of the shipyard to the local economy. The shipyard employed about 4,500 in 1938, and by the day of the Pearl Harbor attack, there were more than 17,000 workers who would soon be plunged directly into the war effort. Of course, on December 7th, 1941, Japan launches their attack on the American naval fleet at Pearl Harbor, and America is officially in the war. The Navy Yard reacts swiftly to news of the attack. They quickly mobilize in support of the war effort. And as the nation emerges from the Great Depression and enters into wartime, the stage is now set for the most rapid era of growth ever experienced by the shipyard or the city of Bremerton. And since again, it was among the only places on the West Coast that could repair large warships, the Navy Yard played a significant role in maintaining the Navy's Pacific Fleet. This work would include repairs to more than 400 ships during the war. And this pivotal era would leave lasting effects on both the Navy Yard and the surrounding city. And these changes really began from the first moment that America entered the war. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Navy Yard employees eagerly assisted in the salvage, cleanup, and repair operations, with hundreds of them traveling to Pearl Harbor in the immediate aftermath of the attack. Now, Navy Yard employees knew they would have lots of work to do as soon as the damaged ships could get underway. And in fact, Bremerton Shipyard would serve as the main repair facility for 5 US battleships that survived the Japanese attack. They were USS Tennessee, Maryland, Nevada, California, and West Virginia. And these 5 battleships were nicknamed the Ghost Fleet because though Japan had declared them sunk in the surprise attack, the shipyard was able to return them to service, and they came back to haunt the Japanese fleet for the rest of the war. And while all of this critical work was going on over at the shipyard, Bremerton residents had something else on their minds too. After Pearl Harbor, many local residents feared that a Japanese attack on Bremerton was next. Now, this might seem silly in hindsight, since of course it didn't end up happening, but at the time, they really feared that the Navy Yard would be an important strategic target. And so shipyard employees immediately began securing both the shipyard and the city of Bremerton for that possibility. There were blackouts and dim outs, gas masks and air raid instructions were issued. There were smoke screens to blanket Bremerton and the Navy Yard in thick clouds of dark smoke. Air raid shelters were constructed and placed all around the shipyard grounds. There were hundreds of barrage balloons moored on both land and water to deter dive bombing. Now, these large balloons were anchored by thick anchor cables, and the thought was that low-flying planes coming in for an attack wouldn't be able to see the chains, and they'd become tangled and disabled. And in those days, it said everyone knew a friend of a friend whose chimney had been taken out by one of these balloons come unmoored during high winds. Now, although the increasing work available during the war provided welcome income for thousands, it was not without its costs. City residents often bristled at the security measures encroaching on their city, as it was taken over almost overnight by Navy and Army personnel moving in for the duration of the war. The whole county really was essentially a fort, with civilians intermixing with anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, and infantry. And of course, many of them complained about the large crowds at all hours of the day and night. But Bremerton residents really had no choice but to put up with such intrusions for the benefit of the Puget Sound Navy Yard. Now, with war declared and the city protected from potential attacks, the shipyard starts operating around the clock. Its primary mission is to repair Pacific Fleet warships that had been damaged in battle, getting them back out to the fleet as quickly as possible. And one of my favorite stories of ship repair during World War II is Uss New Orleans. She's the one in the bottom right image on this slide. Now, in November of 1942, she lost her entire bow. After stopping in Sydney, Australia to have a temporary one installed, a project that actually involved palm tree logs, New Orleans sailed backwards, making her way to Bremerton. And by the time she got here, a new bow had already been built for her, using plans from her sister ship, USS Astoria, which had been coincidentally built at the shipyard a decade earlier. And when USS New Orleans arrived at the shipyard, it was discovered that the new bow was out of line by just 1/8 of an inch. And when you picture the giant scale of the warships, that's really amazing. And soon USS New Orleans was as good as new. Now, with all this work going on at the shipyard, there was, of course, a labor shortage. On the day of Pearl Harbor, there's about 17,000 workers here, but soon they put out a national recruitment campaign encouraging Americans to come to Bremerton from all over the country. And heeding the call, as many as 300 potential new hires arrive every single day. They come from all corners of the country, and some had never even seen the ocean before. So of course they marvel at the huge ships that are docked here. And at the Navy Yard, there are 32,000 workers fueling the war effort by 1945. Of course, many of them were women. By the end of the war, women make up more than 1/4 of the workforce at the shipyard. Most of them were civilians, as was the case at most defense industry plants, but some had enlisted in the Navy as waves, or women accepted for volunteer emergency service. There are about 250 waves stationed in Bremerton during the war. There were also quite a few high school students working at the shipyard. By 1941, there were so many families coming to Bremerton for the promise of shipyard work that Bremerton High School was overwhelmed. It starts operating in split shifts. So many students attend school during the morning and then rush to work at the shipyard after school. With all these new workers heading here, Bremerton's population tripled in just 3 years. Bremerton in 1940 was a relatively modest town of about 15,000. But by the war's end, some estimates placed Bremerton's population as high as 80,000. Can you imagine living through that change in such a short period? Now, the city and its shipyard were transformed almost overnight as thousands of war workers flooded in. Federal housing projects popped up to help house them, mainly around the perimeter of the city. And as a result, the city's land area nearly doubled from 1937 to 1945. But even with all this federal money coming in for war worker housing, it was never enough. Town residents also made room for workers in their homes and their garages, but housing demands remained so great that workers also lived in tents, trailers, cars, and in some cases, even hastily converted chicken coops. Now, at its height, the shipyard employed 32,000 workers, and many were women and African Americans drawn to Washington state by the promise of wartime work. But these demographic changes were not without controversy, both within the shipyard itself and in the surrounding community. The 1940 census reported 17 Black residents in Bremerton. By the height of wartime, more than 4,500 Black employees worked at the shipyard. Now, unfortunately, they were met with some discrimination, including whites-only signs in establishments throughout the city. This fact was noted with some concern in a classified report produced by the local Naval district, mentioning that racial unrest could become a labor issue. And while the federal government set out to house white shipyard workers in a variety of housing projects throughout the county, African American shipyard workers and their families lived in a separate, segregated community. Known as Sinclair Park, it is the small rectangle to the far west side of this wartime map, right about there. Now, as was common in racially segregated communities of this era, it was isolated from the rest of the city, it had no bus service, and it was further from schools and grocery stores than the white neighborhoods. But despite the racist housing policies that brought them together, the residents of Sinclair Park formed tight-knit bonds during the war, coalescing around the Sinclair Park Community Center. They formed their own chapters of the USO and the Elks Club, and it's no coincidence that the local NAACP chapter was formed here in 1943. And yet, for Navy leadership, racial issues were swept under the rug in service to the wartime effort. With a diverse workforce of more than 32,000, the shipyard itself buzzed with activity 24/7. And the workers were told not to talk about their work once they'd left the shipyard gates. Their construction and repair records were no secret. They saw more than 400 ships during the war, and they repaired 26 battleships, some more than once, along with 18 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, and 79 destroyers. They also built 53 brand new ships, including 5 aircraft carriers. And of course, their contributions enabled the Pacific Fleet to participate in crucial naval battles and ultimately to win the war in the Pacific. But despite the end of the official war, their wartime job wasn't over quite yet. As soon as World War II was officially over, shipyard employees started post-war work that was codenamed Operation Magic Carpet. In 1945, there are still several million American soldiers and sailors scattered all around the world, all eager to get home as quickly as possible. And so the Puget Sound Navy Yard shifts its mission to installing bunks in warships converting them into troop transports. Then as things quieted down, war industries, including the shipyard, slashed their workforce. Many workers welcomed the time off. After working 6 days a week for years, they had considerable savings and they were really ready for a break. Hundreds had already quit within a week of Japan's surrender. And by 1946, the shipyard's force had dropped all the way down to 9,000. World War II had defined Bremerton, putting both the city and its shipyard on the map. Nothing in the city's past had prepared it for the scope of demands that would arrive with the war, and really no event to the present day has compared. Now, since the end of the war, the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard has remained one of the Navy's busiest shipbuilding and repair facilities. Now, this is normally the part where I'd invite you to my museum to learn more about the impressive history of the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. We, of course, remain closed due to COVID, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have either today or anytime in the future. Thanks again for joining me this afternoon, and now I'll turn things over to Lisa.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was fascinating. And while we're making that transition, John, you can go ahead and share your slides with us and pop your questions into the chat now while you're thinking about them. And we will get back to Megan's, any questions you have about Megan's presentation at the end. And we'll just go ahead with John. Thank you so much. John, take it away when you're ready.
Okay. Oops. Go to the next screen. Okay. Can you hear me okay, Lisa and everyone?
Can hear you just great. And just a quick reminder, I'll give you a 2-minute warning if needed.
Yep. Okay. Before the passage of the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, Boeing showed no real hostility toward labor, just indifference. And part of that was because Washington was, and actually remains, one of only 5 states that still practiced the ancient, not to say primitive, doctrine of at-will employment, meaning that any employer could terminate any employee at any time for any reason, including no reason given, and the employee could not sue for wrongful dismissal. At-will employment probably explains why Boeing's hourly paid employees would insist so strongly on having a seniority clause written into their labor contracts, which, as we shall see, would be the central issue in the Great Strike of 1948. Despite their plight, however, aircraft workers had little interest in organizing as the American Federation of Labor wanted them to, which was by trade or by shop. The aircraft workers' attitude was, hey, we're aircraft workers, not carpenters, electricians, etc. And they were very proud of that because aircraft were the apex technology of that era. Things began to change, however, on July 2nd, 1935, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed into law the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, which permanently swung the balance of power in management labor relations away from management and toward labor. Boeing shop workers quickly voted to be represented by the International Association of Machinists, the IAM, which specifically had set out to recruit aircraft workers. The IAM had been created in 1888 in, of all places, Atlanta, Georgia. Perhaps for that reason, the IAM accepted only white males, preferably American-born. The IAM began admitting women as full members in 1911, but refused to admit African Americans until 1948. And Boeing's aircraft workers had to get work permits from the IAM in order to work in Boeing's plants during World War II. The IAM's International organized District Lodge 751 at Boeing on September 28, 1935, with 35 members, and on June 26, 1936, Lodge 751 signed its first labor contract with Boeing, which was the IAM's first contract with any aircraft manufacturer. Among other things, the contract made Boeing a union shop, but that would not last for long. And as with most American unions, the IAM would pledge in December of 1941 not to strike for the duration of the war. Boeing's Plant 2 at East Marginal Way South and South 14th Avenue South in Seattle, opened in November of 1936 and expanded, 36, and expanded for the first time in 1938. At Plant 2, between 1936 and 1945, Boeing would build 6,981 B-17 Flying Fortresses. However, before Plant 2 began large-scale construction, three dramatic changes to the business of building and buying military aircraft occurred. First, in the summer of 1940, the government switched from buying airplanes by fixed-price contracts to cost-plus fixed-fee contracts, which allowed the manufacturers to pass all costs along to the federal government and guaranteed the manufacturers a fixed fee, read profit, of about 6%. Despite sounding like an open invitation to fraud, cost-plus contracting actually worked quite efficiently during World War II. Secondly, in May of 1941, Boeing delivered its last non-military airplane, so 100% of Boeing's wartime production would go to the federal government, thereby enabling the government to dictate all of Boeing's wages. And finally, on January 12, 1942, President Roosevelt signed into law by executive order the National War Labor Board to maintain wartime production by preventing strikes and lockouts and by adjudicating wage disputes within the defense industry. The net result of those three changes was that all of Boeing's employees, from the president to the janitors, effectively worked for the federal government during World War II, and all of Lodge 751's wage disputes would be between the Lodge and the National War Labor Board, not Boeing. Lodge 751's only direct negotiations with Boeing would be over working conditions, never money. The United States Army Air Forces eventually bought 12,731 of Boeing's B-17 bombers, which was Boeing's first ever large-scale production run. To meet the urgent demand, Boeing set up the so-called BVD pool, standing for Boeing Vega Douglas, to build B-17s. Boeing would build 6,981, all at Plant 2 in Seattle. The Vega Aircraft Corporation in Burbank, California, built 2,750, and the Douglas Aircraft Company in Long Beach built 2,995. For such efficient production of B-17s, Boeing became, in 1942, the first American aircraft manufacturer to receive the federal government's coveted Army-Navy E for Excellence Award for the production of war materiel, and less than 5% of defense contractors would receive the award. And basically, Plant 2 was a model operation. There was, however, a labor shortage throughout World War II. First, there was stiff competition for war workers from all over Washington, especially from Puget Sound shipyards, which were building naval and merchant ships for Megan's Museum, and from the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in eastern Washington. Secondly, many of Boeing's workers were drafted or enlisted voluntarily in the military. Third, for reasons that predated the war, Boeing paid less than did other defense contractors in the area. Fourth, Boeing had an excellent training program for new unskilled workers, but the combination of excellent training and low wages gave Boeing a 130% annual turnover among its workforce. Workers would get trained by Boeing and then take their new skills elsewhere to earn more money. The result was that Boeing became something of a farm team for defense contractors all over the Pacific Northwest. Fifth, in addition to high turnover, Boeing also suffered from a high absentee rate of up to 10% per shift. Boeing's workers had an attitude of, hey, if they fire me, I can always get hired somewhere else, which was true. And finally, good news about the war from early 1943 on led to a belief that, hey, this war is nearly over and I need to get a job that's going to last beyond the war. So many experienced workers left Boeing at their earliest opportunity. Boeing survived by recruiting women into its factory workforce. In March of 1942, women made up only about 2.6% of Boeing's factory workforce, but by the end of that year, that was up to 42%. A year later, it was up to 46%, and in 1944, which was the year of Boeing's peak production, women made up more than half of Boeing's factory workforce. During World War II, about 25% of all working women in the USA worked in the aircraft industry more than in any other aspect of the war economy. At the end of World War II, virtually all of Boeing's Rosies were laid off, though many resigned voluntarily, but wartime work had laid the foundations for the women's movement of the 1960s. The only wartime protest by Boeing's workers came in February of 1943. By then, Lodge 751's factory workers had not had a pay raise since 1937, and they demanded one. But because all wages were set by the National War Labor Board, because all of Boeing's production was for the federal government, and because Lodge 751 had taken a no-strike pledge in 1941, it was very difficult for Lodge 751 to make its demands known, even though Boeing actually wanted Lodge 751's workers to get a pay raise, which would facilitate Boeing's competition for workers. Unfortunately, to check inflation, the National War Labor Board wanted to suppress wages, and particularly within the aircraft industry, because it was the largest single component of America's war economy. So Lodge 751's only real friend, the Roosevelt administration, became the Lodge's opponent, thereby putting Lodge 751 on the horns of a dilemma. In the first of many bad decisions during and after World War II, Lodge 751 publicly threatened to strike in February of 1943 and to take workers from Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego and Lockheed Aircraft in Burbank, California with them. That was a serious threat to the war economy. On Thursday, February 25, 1943, Lodge 751 called a quote-unquote general meeting for all 20,000 or so of its members at the Fraternal Order of Eagles Auditorium building, downtown Seattle, at 7th and Union, still there, which required members to miss work that day. At the meeting, the workers spontaneously voted to march on Seattle City Hall, where they were greeted by a rather surprised Mayor William F. Devon, who expressed his sympathy but couldn't do anything to help the workers. The workers then went home peacefully, creating a de facto one-day wildcat strike. Reactions from the public, the media, and the government were immediate and almost invariably hostile. Lodge 751 was castigated for being disloyal and even subversive. Lodge 751 immediately realized its mistake, beat a hasty retreat, claiming that it had never intended to strike and never did attempt another strike during the war. Lodge 751 eventually did get a pay raise, though not until January 5th, 1944, more than 10 months after the quote-unquote strike. In addition to building Boeing's B-17 Flying Fortress, Seattle area plants also built Boeing's B-29 Super Fortress, which was the finest bomber of World War II, though it always would be a troubled program. The B-29 also was the most expensive weapon system of World War II, costing some $3 billion, which would be about $45.36 billion today. The B-29 first flew on September 21st, 1942 from Boeing Field, and B-29s would be built in 4 factories: Boeing's plants in Wichita, Kansas, and Renton, Washington, the Bell Aircraft Corporation's plant in Marietta, Georgia, and the Glenn L. Martin Company's plant in Omaha, Nebraska. The B-29 program got off to a disastrous start when, at about 12:45 p.m. on Thursday, February 18, 1943, the second of the 3 XB-29 prototypes pancaked onto the roof of the Fry and Company meatpacking plant at Airport Way South and South Walker Street in Seattle, killing all 11 men aboard, including Boeing's chief test pilot, 20 Fry employees, and 1 Seattle firefighter. The cause of the crash was one of the many in-flight fires that would plague the B-29 throughout its career, and which were due to the rushed development of the B-29 and its powerful but hot-running engines. By the time that Boeing's then new Renton plant was ready to start building B-29s in late 1943, Renton was competing against Boeing's own plant too in South Seattle for workers. In the words of one Army officer, quoting, "The local pool of labor has been pretty much exhausted," close quotation. Consequently, Renton had a chronic shortage of personnel, including management and engineers, but especially of factory workers. By October of 1944, Renton was short by some 4,000 workers. Also by 1944, the Renton plant was suffering from shortages of materiel, especially of aluminum. The net result was that the Renton plant never met its quotas or schedules. For example, between October of 1944 and September of 1945, Renton fell short of its quotas by 470 B-29s. That's enough to equip 41 squadrons or 10 bombardment groups. Renton came up short not only on quantity, but also on quality. Renton-built B-29s always required more post-delivery remediation than did the B-29s from any of the other three B-29 plants. In short, the B-29 program represented a paradox. The most sophisticated, most complicated, and most capable airplane of World War II was built by Boeing's least qualified, least experienced, and least capable workers. Somehow, the B-29 program succeeded, but just barely. Boeing's president during World War II, Philip P.G. Johnson, began his second tour as Boeing's president on September 9, 1939, and just in time. His greatest expertise was in mass production, and that was the order of the day. It was Johnson, in fact, who set up the highly successful production for the B-17, including the BVD pool with Vega and Douglas down in California. Despite his dour image in photographs, such as this one, he actually was quite friendly and universally liked, including by Lodge 751's members. He really had the common touch and had been a working man himself. Phil Johnson, more than anyone else, ensured good relations between Boeing and Lodge 751 during World War II. And there were really three other reasons for Boeing's harmonious labor management relations during the war. First, all wage negotiations were conducted between Lodge 751 and the National War Labor Board, not Boeing. Secondly, Boeing shared Lodge 751's desire for higher wages for workers in order to help the company to compete for labor. And finally, Lodge 751's only negotiations with Boeing were over working conditions on which Johnson always conceded because he planned to retire as soon as the war ended. In other words, all of his concessions would become his successor's problem. Johnson's most serious concession was to grant rights of seniority to Lodge 751's members. In short, the Lodge's members were used to getting their way with Phil Johnson, which would not be the case with his successor. Tragically, Johnson died unexpectedly of a stroke while on a business trip to Wichita on September 14, 1944. Boeing's chairman, Claire Egvet, became the interim president and immediately began the search for Johnson's predecessor, taking nearly a year. That successor would be William M. Bill Allen, a partner in Boeing's lead law firm, Todd Holman and Sprague, which is now known as Perkins Coie, and who had sat on Boeing's board of directors since 1930. Actually, Allen was a compromise candidate after two factions within Boeing became deadlocked over their respective candidates for the presidency. Allen did not believe that he was qualified, but reluctantly agreed to take the job when the board prevailed upon him, and he assumed the presidency on Wednesday, September 5th, 1945, just 3 days after Japan's formal surrender. Ironically, many now consider Allen to be Boeing's greatest president ever, but he did not have Phil Johnson's common touch. While he had tremendous integrity, he disliked unions and tended to view things as a lawyer through the prism of contract law, which would cause friction with Lodge 751. Bill Allen would have no honeymoon as Boeing's new boss. This photograph shows the interior of Boeing's Renton plant shortly after World War II, when it was closed and used only for storage, including for the circus elephants in the foreground, indicating just how quickly and completely Boeing had scaled back its production after World War II. Indeed, on Bill Allen's first day as Boeing's president, September 5th, 1945, the Army Air Forces cut its orders for B-29 bombers by more than had been expected, forcing Allen to lay off 21,000 workers that very day, and there were no 60-day warn notices back then. Quite understandably, Lodge 751 immediately rescinded its no-strike pledge of December 1941, and all of the pre-war tensions between labor and management immediately returned with full fury. It was not a fun time to be Boeing's president and CEO. On March 16, 1946, District Lodge 751 signed its first post-war labor contract with Boeing, which granted a 15% pay raise and affirmed Lodge 751's seniority rights and status as a union shop. But the contract also contained a poison pill clause that had been inserted by Boeing's aggressively anti-union director of industrial relations, Archie F. Logan, stating that the contract would, and I'm quoting the relevant portion here, remain in force until March 16, 1947 or thereafter until a new agreement has been reached by the parties, either through negotiation or arbitration, close quotation. Incredibly, although the IAM had been negotiating contracts for 60 years, it did not yet have a legal department and utterly failed to understand that Logan's Clause meant that the contract of March 16, 1946 had, in effect, no expiration date, and that Lodge 751 never could strike, meaning that Lodge 751 had signed away its most powerful weapon. On March 16, 1947, when the contract of 1946 was due for renewal, Boeing demanded an end to seniority rights, arguing that seniority was unworkable in the peacetime economy due to the practice of bumping, which allowed every laid-off worker to bump a less senior worker out of his job, taking that worker's job, unless the more senior worker then got bumped himself by a worker who had even more seniority. Just laying off 200 workers had taken over 3 months to complete due to all of the bumping, and large layoffs would literally take years to complete. Lodge 751, however, refused to concede on seniority rights, so the contract of March 16, 1946 remained in effect indefinitely. 3 months later, June of 1947, the Democrat-controlled Congress overwhelmingly overrode Democratic President Harry S. Truman's veto of the strongly anti-labor Taft-Hartley Act, reflecting the public's disgust with all of the strikes that had taken place since World War II. Among other provisions, the Taft-Hartley Act required a 60-day notice for a cooling-off period before a strike could begin. Heedless of its contract with Boeing and of the Taft-Hartley Act, however, Lodge 751 impetuously set a strike date, naively believing that the Lodge could force concessions from Boeing, a nearly fatal miscalculation. At 1 a.m. on Thursday, April 22, 1948, some 14,800 members of Lodge 751 went on strike despite having no authorization from the IAM's International, having given only 6 days' notice, and having no strike fund, all incredible blunders by Lodge 751. Upon learning of the strike, Boeing's litigious president, Bill Allen, immediately informed the IAM's International that the strike was illegal, that Lodge 751 had forfeited its rights to represent Boeing's hourly paid workers, and that all of the striking workers would be terminated. The next day, Friday, April 23, 1948, Boeing began breaking the strike. First, Boeing announced that plants 1 and 2 in Seattle would reopen on Monday, April 26th, and that all workers were required to report as scheduled. Secondly, Boeing began advertising for permanent replacement workers. And third, Boeing teamed up with Dave Beck of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters to create a rival union to replace the IAM, the Aeronautical Workers, Warehousemen, and Helpers Union, Local 451. With no strike fund to support them, some 2,000 of Lodge 751's most desperate strikers had crossed the picket lines by June of 1948, providing enough workers for Boeing to resume limited production and to roll out a completed B-50 bomber during the week of June 7th. By the July of 1948, the number of Lodge 751's increasingly desperate workers crossing the picket lines equaled the number of new hires, and both numbers grew daily. By September of 1948, it was clear that Lodge 751's misguided strike had no chance of winning any concessions from Boeing. So on Monday, September 13th, Boeing agreed to rehire virtually all of Lodge 751's remaining strikers. With that assurance, Lodge 751's demoralized members voted by 12-1 to end their illegal 144-day strike with no contract, no seniority rights, and the loss of their status as a union shop, thereby giving William M. Allen and Boeing a complete victory and creating a costly and humiliating defeat for Lodge 751 and the International Association of Machinists. In conclusion, Boeing's relations with Lodge 751 of the International Association of Machinists were quite good during World War II and enabled the delivery of 6,981 B-17s and 2,766 B-29s, both of which were instrumental in winning World War II. With the military's abrupt cancellation of its huge contracts at the war's end, however, Boeing and other defense contractors had no choice but to lay off tens of thousands of workers. To fight the layoffs, the country's labor union staged more strikes between 1946 and 1948 than the country ever had seen in any comparable period. Unfortunately, most of the strikes proved to be costly misfires, creating public and political anger at, not support for, labor. Of all of labor's post-war misfires, few can compare to Lodge 751's illegal strike against Boeing in 1948. Specifically, Lodge 751's monumental and almost criminal incompetence left its members with only two choices: to find another job or to cross their own picket lines, as seen in this photograph. The strike of 1948 remains unprecedented in its length and bitterness, remains the strike by which all strikes against Boeing are measured to this day, and serves as a cautionary tale of how not to strike a Fortune 500 corporation. Thank you. Lisa?
Thank you very much, John. And while we're making that transition to Bill's slides, I neglected to tell you the title of his presentation, so we'll do that right now. Act Globally, Act Locally, the Washington National Guard on Homefront and Battlefront. And also, I also neglected to mention that Megan is a current member of the Pacific Northwest Historians Guild Board. And so I thank her for being a colleague and co-conspirator on the board. And also Bill Woodward is a former president of the Guild. So we're well represented and appreciate their service. So Bill, go ahead and you can share your slides at any time.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Thanks, John and Megan. This is a second partnership with them going back to last fall, and I'm just thoroughly enjoying learning from them and hoping I can contribute. I'm going to talk in an introductory fashion for a little while before I take the moments to see if I can't share my screen fairly smoothly. And I'm going to even start with a little bit of a maybe too self-conscious personal note. History, writing, and programming in recent years, and much of the content of this conference as well, has brought into sharp highlight stories once left out. The people and places at the edge of the screen, so to speak, encounters with the other, we sometimes say, and rightly so. This panel, and specifically my final presentation, tries to bring from margin to center focus another class of other, if you will, a differently defined minority population, those whose identity is centered on their roles in service to their country's defense, whether in or out of uniform. Most ways I'm pretty plain vanilla, kind of boring with no connection, but I am an aging veteran, and so I personally identify with this perhaps forgotten or sometimes stereotyped class of people, Knut Berger's musings notwithstanding. It's really a delight for me to be able to share, as part of this presentation, images from the extensive collection of the Washington National Guard State Historical Society that I worked with, and a salute to my co-authors on our book, Andy Leneweaver and Rick Patterson. But please forgive me if my paper then seems a little more personal than most objective accounts. On 16 September 1940, a year after the outbreak of war in Europe, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered Washington's National Guard soldiers into federal service. The administration could no longer bow to isolationist sentiment. Megan's paper alluded to that with respect to the Navy between the wars, and ignore an increasingly threatening world. Upgrading American military readiness was long overdue. Ranked 17th in the world just after Romania, the U.S. Army was only slightly better prepared to fight a major war than the Boy Scouts, grumped a recent historian. Among several preparedness initiatives in that time frame was to mobilize the state forces known collectively as the National Guard for an ostensible year of training. That scenario is how I both began and ended my presentation to the Pacific Northwest History Conference last fall, the three of us described interwar developments, and you heard a little bit of review of those in Megan's and John's presentations under the rubric unplanned preparations for unanticipated war. After the Great War, in strategy analyst Michael Lynn's telling, both the British and the Americans reverted to their heritage of low military spending and loath to join any international commitments in the case of the Americans. Thus, it was the National Guard that sustained what minimal residual land force Americans would tolerate. And to the National Guard, the nation had to turn when that land force had to expand massively and quickly. The Washington Guard modernized and mechanized in the 1920s and 30s and built new facilities, often as New Deal work projects. One of those, incidentally, was a brand new armory in Seattle. You may recognize it as the still standing armory at the Seattle Center. Though unanticipated, war indeed broke out in September 1939, while Americans were still mired in their Great Depression. Even before Pearl Harbor, Puget Sound ramped up its industrial capacity, as you've heard, and the Washington National Guard continued to seek new recruits, often because it offered a small but steady paycheck to young men with iffy job prospects. So let's pause momentarily and see if we can't do this. No. I'm following our process, but I'm not seeing that little blue button. Lisa, let's see if I can do this again. Okay, here we go, maybe. There we go, yeah.
Excellent. We got it.
Now, are we seeing it? Is it, are you all seeing it?
We see it.
Y'all still
Thank
hearing me?
you.
We're good, huh? Okay. So those young citizen soldiers in September of 1940 would act globally, but first act locally in communities large and small before their long service on Homefront and Battlefront. One of these was a recent arrival from St. Louis named Elliot Cowden. He joined the Field Artillery Regiment housed in that new Seattle Armory, learning with his fellow soldiers how to set guns now propelled by motor, not horses. Interestingly, as the European conflict heated up, his superiors warned him of the looming call-up, suggesting that having fulfilled his enlistment, he might want to separate from the service. Cowden would spend the war in the strategic Homefront role of finding housing for the thousands soon to arrive to work the wartime jobs at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, at Boeing, that yanked Puget Sound out of its Depression doldrums. He incidentally would go on to a career in real estate and later become a founder of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society and its Log House Museum. Many other young men filled the National Guard slots that Cowden and others vacated. Often high school or college students, they signed on so they could serve with buddies or show the Axis they'd better not mess with America. On the other side of the state, in Pullman, Washington State College engineering student Edwin Park enlisted in the local infantry unit, joining another local, recent high school graduate Carlisle Ragsdale. They were two who would mobilize in response to the president's call-up order. With peers from throughout Washington and neighboring states, they all converged on Camp Murray, south of Tacoma, combat and support elements of the massive 41st Infantry Division. By the time the Guardsmen assembled, the division had grown to nearly 14,000 strong. Camp Murray and the adjacent Fort Lewis struggled to accommodate the influx. The new population also taxed the off-post offerings and patience of the surrounding population. They were told it was for 1 year of training, In good-hearted citizen soldier spirit, they sang, "Goodbye, dear, I'll be back in a year." But ever-increasing peril would, to their surprise, extend the 12 months to 18, and then the Japanese attack would stretch 1 year to 5. Indeed, those soldiers would be among the first to deploy overseas after Pearl Harbor, to fight in the South Pacific through the long years of war, to remain comrades for the duration in the case of a few like Park and Ragsdale, and to become veterans who late in life would work to preserve their stories by talking to historians like me. Yet, dispatching most of its soldiers to the National Army was not the only way the Washington National Guard would contribute. Duty within the continental United States became the lot of some of the state's force. To better picture all these interweaving threads, imagine a narrative arc in the shape of a recumbent Y. At first, almost all Guard soldiers staged with the 41st Division at Camp Murray. Beginning in early 1942, the trajectories diverged. Most deployed to 2 sectors of the Pacific Theater, but many served closer to home on the Pacific Coast, if not right here in Puget Sound. Let's first look at the Camp Murray experience, and then the stateside service, and finally track those soldiers who fought across the Southwest Pacific. Before proceeding, a parenthetical explanation may be helpful to some of you. State-controlled organized militia forces have an ancient pedigree, but the origins of the National Guard of the states as a reserve force for the federal military dates only to the Spanish-American and Philippine-American wars at the turn of the 20th century. U.S. national security in that imperial age required modernization of land and sea services by the way establishing the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, as Megan showed us a snapshot of, was part of that process. These standing forces were to be augmented by a statutory role for the militias of the states. They were to be truly now a National Guard. 3 major acts of Congress wrapped around the Guard service in the First World War established this new dual mission, as it is known. It's why Guard men and women today are protecting the U.S. Capitol, dispensing vaccines, distributing water to Texans, and fighting in the Middle East. Now, in camp, while the Nazis blitzed Britain and Japan menaced the Pacific, again, we're talking about the fall of 1940, the newly federalized Guardsmen spent a miserable fall and winter, suffering from influenza, piercing winds, incessant rains, and pea soup fogs. The weather was so bad, you may have heard this story, it roiled the newly opened Tacoma Narrows Bridge nearby enough to snap it in 2. As soldiers fell into training routines and mundane duties, their uniforms, quote unquote, were not uniform. The soldier at right sports a World War I helmet and bootlegging. His buddy gets by in blue denims, vintage service cap, and common work shoes. Innovative quartermaster officers reportedly shopped for work pants for the soldiers from the local Montgomery ward. A shared wood-floored canvas tent became a soldier's primitive new home. Canvas cots ringed a remarkably ineffective wood stove. Sparks often burnt holes in the canvas. Hot coals would ignite the platform beneath. Some soldiers bootlegged a retail potbelly into their cramped quarters. Life in a tent city required a lot of time devoted to sheer survival. As chilly fall rains began, cutting firewood became a daily chore. We debated whether the wood was stacked to dry it out or keep it wet, recalled Ragsdale. The following winter would prove unusually wet, turning the orderly tent city into a soggy, gloomy, unhealthy Swamp Murray, as they called it. But be careful what you wish for. As spring 1941 advanced, the misery of dank Swamp Murray gave way to the oppression of exhausting heat, a forecast of the steam bath to come in the South Pacific. Still, training was the point. You're in the Army now, and the bugle runs your day. You wake up to reveille at dark 30. The rapid-fire staccato triads got soldiers up and out for the chow line. And just in case you weren't quite awake, your training day began with early morning formation and calisthenics, often in the mud, as with this medical regimen. Weapons training was paramount. First came knowledge and care of one's own rifle, checked at regular inspections. Next came target practice on a firing range. As spring turned to summer, 1941, the division swelled, slimmed, and moved. New soldiers drafted under the Selective Service Act began to arrive. Conversely, the Army determined that the division was unwieldy in its size, paring it down to just 3 infantry regiments from 4. In this streamlining, Ragsdale's and Park's 161st Infantry Regiment got detached. The rest of the division was then tested in large-scale exercises down near the California coast at Fort Hunter Liggett between Monterey and San Luis Obispo. So we're now at the fork in the Y. Before following the Orphan 161st and the division, when they finally deployed, let me review what was going on stateside. A month after the federalized National Guardsmen descended on Camp Murray, Congress authorized and Washington State activated a home defense force, officially designated as the Washington State Guard. It comprised infantry, engineer, anti-aircraft, and anti-tank battalions, I don't get that, plus a radio intelligence company and cavalry troop. By mid-1942, State Guard strength stood at 150 officers and nearly 4,000 enlisted men. Somewhat belying this recruiting display on the left, the actual members were often older men not eligible for federal service. I can relate. Soon after the division's activation, other specialized units in the Washington Guard structure, most notably flying and coastal defense elements, were called up and dispatched to defend the Pacific coast from Los Angeles all the way to Alaska. Based in Spokane, the 116th Observation Squadron had achieved local celebrity since its creation in the 1920s. The Guard flyboys used their custom high-altitude cameras to provide aerial photos for the National Geographic magazine, helped the Spokane sheriff chase criminals, conduct searches, and help fix the site of the future Grand Coulee Dam, by the way. Back in 1931, they had been showcased in a spectacular air show, complete with mock dogfights and a precision flyby. After September 1941, they were based at Gray Field at Fort Lewis, but moved frequently to Yakima and Hoquiam, then to Corvallis, Oregon, and finally to Oklahoma City. Many of you, no doubt, have visited the old forts at Admiralty Inlet or the mouth of the Columbia. The Washington Guard coast artillerists, who had long augmented the regulars at these now hopelessly obsolete installations, discovered a new mission against a new weapon using even newer technology. The recently created 205th Coast Artillery Anti-Aircraft Regiment, called to active service in February 1941, now pointed its palisade of 90-millimeter guns at the sky, not the sea. To track and target fast-moving aircraft, they employed an automatic fire control system integrating telescope rangefinder mechanisms and a newly invented so-called electric director, emerging of first-generation radar and computer technologies. The 205th and its older cousin, the 248th, dispersed their constituent elements to guard coasts from Los Angeles to Alaska, and then eventually to Scotland. And in the meantime, everything had changed with the stunning news of the Japanese attack on Hawaii. It came to one of the Washington Guard units in a kind of poignantly timely way. Remember that infantry regiment, the 161st by name, that had been stripped from the division? Well, their first intended employment, very early, they learned in late 1941, was in the Philippines. The United States needed to reinforce its skeleton troop units defending that Asian archipelago, and ordered the 161st to entrain for San Francisco, where they would board ships for the far Pacific. The cars rumbled southward shortly after noon one Sunday. The train stopped for a few minutes near Klamath Falls, Oregon. The station master rushed out. Say, have you guys heard? The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor? It was 7 December. Orders changed. the Washington soldiers would be spared the Bataan Death March. Immediately after Pearl, soldiers of the 41st were hastily dispatched to the Pacific beaches to keep watch for the expected attack of Japanese Zeros on Washington State. As Megan Churchwell described some of the same panic responses at the Shipyard, that prospect really was infinitely remote, given the 2,500 miles farther than the Hawaiian chain that a Japanese carrier fleet would have to sail. But those guardsmen who nervously scanned the skies, armed with puny individual weapons, never forgot the bewildered anxiety and anger they felt. They wouldn't stay at their Pacific Pistol Patrol for long, for Hawaii and Australia beyond remained in grave danger. Let's look first at the 161st Infantry Regiment. It would end up at its originally intended destination, the Philippines, but only after a circuitous odyssey. They staged first in Hawaii, then reality bit. They joined the newly created 25th Infantry Division and entered combat at bloody Guadalcanal in the Solomon Chain. First, that southernmost island, and then New Georgia to the northwest were their targets. American strategy dictated retaking Japanese island strongholds, then occupying airfields and naval installations, then vectoring toward the Philippines. With those islands retaken, American land, sea, and air forces would combine for the expected bloody invasion of the Japanese home islands. That was the Pacific's grand strategy. Well, when the 161st arrived at Guadalcanal in January 1943, the now famous fight in the remote South Pacific had been raging for 5 months, Army and Marine forces together. As the hard slog up the Solomons progressed, weapons of every type came into play: machine guns, flamethrowers, bazookas. The infantrymen would clear a hill, pillbox by pillbox, then move on to the next objective. It was brutal going. With the battle for the Solomons finally won, the regiment spent the summer and fall of 1944 on the island of New Caledonia in intensive jungle training, and then returned to battle in early 1945 as part of a massive landing at Lingayen Gulf, Luzon, in the Philippines. Extended heavy combat followed into the interior. With Japanese resistance finally eliminated, the regiment awaited the anticipated assault on the Japanese home islands. Carlisle Ragsdale later remembered his relief and joy when the atomic bomb led to the Japanese surrender. The regiment landed in southern Honshu to perform occupation duty, where Ragsdale compared assault planning maps to the Japanese coast defenses. None of us would have made it to the beach, he told me decades later. The 41st Infantry Division had a somewhat different Pacific story. In the first months after the triumph at Pearl Harbor, Japan swept southward. Australia lay defenseless, its armed forces fighting the Axis in the Mediterranean. Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall chose the 41st to step into the breach, the first American division to deploy. Rushed down under, they assembled at Seymour, Victoria. On 14 April 1942, they were reviewed by the Army Minister of a grateful Australia. At Seymour, Sergeant Hugh Williams of the Medical Regiment began a log of his ports of call. Once Australia was secured, elements of the 41st went on the offensive, first along the north coast of New Guinea in January of 1943. Their relentless fighting earned from General Douglas MacArthur the nickname Jungle Leaders. Their toughest battle, there they are, their toughest battle came on the island of Biak, just west of New Guinea, where John Dawson of the Field Artillery stands at his gun. The division would next jump to the island of Mindanao in the southern Philippines for the seizure of the Zamboanga Peninsula in March 1945. After the Japanese surrender, General MacArthur assigned the 41st to occupy the area around Hiroshima. one of the earliest Americans to enter the devastated city, a medic by the name of Leon Aller, later a physician in Snohomish County, experienced the horror directly. It was still seared in memory in the recounting to me years later. Counting that post-surrender duty, the 41st clocked 45 months away from American soil, the longest overseas service of any American division. Many survived, but jungle warfare took a heavy toll, nearly 5,000 casualties, including 1,000 dead. One final story, this an outlier. Out of morbid memory of the trenches at the Western Front, a new specialized function had developed between the wars, the anti-tank outfit, which morphed into the more aggressively named Tank Destroyer Unit. Soon after Pearl Harbor, a tank destroyer battalion was stitched together from remnants of the mobilized Washington Guard soldiers, not deploying with the 41st or the 161st. After training, the 803rd Tank Destroyer Battalion sailed to Europe in June 1943. After the D-Day landing, it scattered to separate battlefields, to northern France and the Ardennes Forest, to the Rhineland and Germany's Hürtgen Forest, the Battle of the Bulge, and even as far as Austria and Western Czechoslovakia. The basic weapon shown here was this M10 tank destroyer, operating on the same drivetrain, interestingly, as the more familiar Sherman tank. The 803rd claimed a sad distinction. Private First Class Charlie Havelat, born to Czech immigrants, served with the battalion through its bloodiest battles. On the morning of 7 May 1945, Havelat's reconnaissance platoon was blindsided by a hail of machine gun and small arms fire from concealed positions. Havelat took a bullet to the head, ending his life. That final firefight erupted less than 10 minutes after a general ceasefire order and a mere 6 hours before Germany's unconditional surrender. Neither German ambushers nor American tankers had heard the news. Havelat died in his parents' native land, the last American killed in Europe during World War II.
What a dramatic way to end that story, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I have one concluding remark. Maybe I was a little melodramatic there, but just let me finish here by saying that today's National Guard reprises many of the missions, both tragic and triumphant, of the 1940s. For 2 decades, various elements have deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. Recurring natural disasters and civil unrest, you've seen their images in the news, have brought citizen soldiers into domestic active service. The Guard story, indeed the stories of all the armed services, federal and state, air, sea, and land, and now space, often seem off the radar screens of historians, so to speak. And when one finds attention given, it sometimes carries a slight whiff of disdain. But the Pacific Northwest, and Puget Sound in particular, is a place profoundly shaped by the politics and economics, and especially the personal experiences of national defense efforts. Whether uniformed or not, the working people in these systems deserve to have their stories included in any larger narrative. And now I will say thank you and turn it back to Lisa.
I didn't mean to jump in there preemptively. Sorry about that.
It's all right.
Thank you to all of our presenters. We have a couple questions in the chat, but first I just have a personal one, since the papers of Warren Magnuson are what bring a lot of people to special collections at the University of Washington. And I'm just wondering, with military consolidations and all kinds of things that are happening globally around the military, with this three-pronged approach of Army, National Guard, Navy, and Boeing's commercial enterprises in support of defense, do you foresee that we will have another patron saint like the we had in Warren Magnuson to keep that military presence and production here in the Pacific Northwest?
What do you
It's a
think,
great-
Megan?
At this point, the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard is so well established that I can't imagine it going anywhere, regardless of whether there's a political champion for it.
John, let me put this question to you as the Boeing expert. With the new activated U.S. Space Force, I won't ask your commentary on the value of that, but for all that Boeing is moving some of its production, commercial production elsewhere, isn't its military activities, and particularly those related to space, aren't they still local?
Actually, the headquarters for Boeing's military operations is St. Louis, the old McDonnell Douglas
Sure, yeah.
headquarters. And so if anything is going to happen, I suspect that the military will gravitate towards St. Louis, although they're actually moving some things into California, of all places. But yeah, it's where Boeing winds up building things in the future is very much up in the air right now.
One little story that this is my response, Lisa, and I'll be real quick. But one little story that we told in the previous presentation about the interwar years was that Pierce County ceded the tract of land during World War I that was then Camp Lewis, has become Fort Lewis. And speaking of poison pill contract clauses, John, Pierce County said that it would have to be a permanent Army post, and if the Army chose not to keep it, that it would revert to Pierce County. That meant in the 1920s, the Army actually made Fort Lewis a major installation. And in the various rounds of base closures, my guess is Fort Lewis would be among the last. The now Joint Base Lewis McChord would be among the last. So with the home porting of the carriers, with the Air Force installation at JBLM, with Fort Lewis, and then of course with the fiercely defended by politicians and locals alike Naval Air Station on Whidbey Island, my guess is the presence of troops, even if the American military complement reduces, is still going to be pretty present and pretty sizable in the Puget Sound region.
Megan, there was a question specifically for you about Asian Americans working in the shipyard during the war, and if there were, how were they treated?
That's a great question. I really wish there were more sources that spoke just to this. I'm not aware of any data that sheds light on exactly how many there were, but I can't imagine there were that many. Of course, those of Japanese ancestry would have been subject to internment. And in fact, a lot of the arguments for internment specifically cited the location of the Navy Yard in the reasoning. I know of one Filipino shipyard worker whose family lived in Sinclair Park, that segregated housing project I mentioned. And so extrapolating from that, I suspect that any other Asian American workers would have been similarly kind of classified along with the African American workers as sort of a generalized non-white category, but I don't know too much more than that.
There was a question that came in from Jennifer Ott during your presentation, I think. Was there significant inflation between 1937 and 43? It seems like that would have been an extremely challenging time for workers.
Is that for me, John?
I think so, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yes, there was. Inflation was a very real problem, and particularly in Seattle, because first of all, Seattle was already a high cost of living city, considerably higher actually than Southern California, which is kind of surprising. And secondly, unfortunately, price competition within the aircraft industry in the 1930s had kept wages down. And so the workers the workers were the ones who were forced to bear the brunt of that price competition. So the folks in Lodge 751 had a legitimate gripe about the lack of a pay raise between 1937 and 1943. That was not just feather bedding on the part of the union. They really needed a raise, and particularly for aircraft workers.
I don't know whether Megan, in talking about housing, or even you, John, I don't know the implications, but certainly housing was extraordinarily tight.
Yes.
And that would have tended to push up some costs of living as well. That's an inference. I don't know it for sure.
Yeah, absolutely right. And as Megan said in her presentation, there literally were people living in chicken coops during World War II, because there was very little rental housing at that time. Most Americans at that time were home owners. Renting was a much smaller percentage of the population than it is today. And you can find housing all around Seattle, but particularly in Beacon Hill, the area close to Boeing, that was built during World War II specifically to house workers who had come to town to take jobs in the war economy. Those buildings.
And Elliot Cowden, as I mentioned, left the Guard in order to be an advisor to those people that were recruiting labor to see if they could be housed somewhere, somehow. My father-in-law, as a matter of fact, came from Michigan to work for Boeing and was thrilled to find a basement bedroom within walking distance of the plant that he could share with another guy who was on the other ship.
Yeah, he was lucky.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm mindful of the time, so I want to give everybody a quick chance to take a break here real quick. I just want to remind you that we have two simultaneous tracks to follow, Rights and Identities, Track C, and Track D, the law and then some. And I would invite you to please come back at 3:45 just for a couple very brief just wrap up comments. And but first, I'd like to just invite everybody who's nimble fingered enough to do that, to turn on your cameras and just extend our appreciation to our three panelists today and thank them for their presentations. They were all fascinating and I think really give us a lot to think about and dovetails so nicely with Knut's earlier presentation. So thank you, Megan, John, and Bill. Thank you so much. And hopefully I'll see all you back here at 3:45.